Hi, my name is Greg Canty, and I'd like to welcome you to the Win Happy podcast. I love chatting to people from all walks of life about their lives and their careers, about the choices they make along the way to pursue their happiness, and what winning actually means to them. I hope you enjoy these conversations as much as I do. Thanks for listening. On today's podcast, I chat with Alan O'Neill, the former CEO and founder of the Men's Development Network. Alan founded the network in 1997 as he saw a huge need for men to come together and talk about their issues and challenges in a safe, trusted environment. We chatted about the role of dangerous men in the world, causing unnecessary wars that will lead to generations of hatred. Alan also spoke about Ronaldo's tears, the National Men's Health Programme, and the White Ribbon campaign to end violence against women. Let's hear from Alan. Alan O'Neill, a huge welcome to the Win Happy podcast. How are you doing?
I'm doing good, Greg, and thanks for the welcome.
On this Friday morning, what's going on in your life at the moment? What's stressing you? What's occupying your mind?
Well, I suppose, but first of all, just to say, I think it's the 12th of July, so happy Orange Day to us all. And I suppose, stress-wise, I'd be thinking of Ukraine and Gaza and just the stresses that are going on in Eastern Europe. How sad that is, because I would have thought growing up through the 60s and into the 70s that all of that stuff was past. So it's really sad to see leaders, political leaders, taking a violent approach to things. I just find that very upsetting. It's also kind of scary and worrying for the future. And then if you go down into Africa, there's an awful lot of things going on in Sudan and Darfur in particular, and in the Congo. And yeah, it's mostly men that are making these decisions to attack each other. And that's really disappointing. And it's within their capability as men and as human beings just not to take that step. And when I think of Putin and I think of Russia, he runs the biggest country in the world with the most resources in the world. And imagine if you had that to play with. What a country you could create. He could have made Russia into the most desirable place to visit, to live in, to work in. And he chose to go the other way. And you just wonder. So he could have actually expanded Russia's influence psychologically across the whole planet. And instead, he's trying to do it kilometer by kilometer through Ukraine, killing people along the way. I really wonder about him and about the oligarchs, most of them male, who choose that rather than with the personal resources they have in the billions, and also the intellectual resources they had to make that sort of amount of money and that amount of success, that they wouldn't think of an enjoyable way to create a future for us all, rather than the approach they're taking. It's just astounding that they take that approach. If they're interested in making money, and obviously billionaires seem to be very interested in making money, they would have made so much more money by going the positive route. So that's annoying, to put it mildly. And there's so much good in the world. It's just crazy to see being wasted by these guys.
What's wrong with, trying to make a better life for the people living in your country? If you're a leader.
Yes.
If you're a leader in that country, what are your objectives? What are you trying to do for that country? And I think the man above, I often think about this, Alan, the man above must look down and he must think at some level, you've made one right balls of all of this between your jealousies and your power and your greed, your thirst for power. I gave you a lot. I gave you a lot of tools to get on with things. and you're not doing a good job.
No, I mean, when you think of it, we have absolutely everything we need, and we've been brilliant enough. And again, mostly men, if you think of the Industrial Revolution, and then in more recent times, the whole computer age that we're in, a lot of this stuff created by men and have been hugely positive and made life so interesting. I mean, it's an incredible thing. Sometimes when I'm driving along looking at cars, and especially there's lovely designs on cars at the moment, lovely curves. They remind me of some of the modern electric cars remind me of the Batmobile designs from the past. And I just think we're able to take lumps of rock out of the ground. We're able to heat them up enough to get metal out of them. And we're able to bring that metal and form these thin curved sheets and put them together to make these vehicles that we can go anywhere in. I mean, that's how brilliant we are, and it's men who did that. So we're incredibly positive creatures, us men, when we want to be. I just think, that the solutions that we need now to climate change and those sort of challenges that we have, there'll be lots of men, and nowadays women involved, but lots of men involved in sorting this out. And I'm sure we will sort it out because we're brilliant, absolutely brilliant. And so it's that contrast between the wonderful things we can do, the positive things we can do, the absolutely brilliant things we can do, and then the utter mad choices we make to destroy all the things we've done. It's bewildering.
There's a disaster, a volcano, an earthquake, a tsunami, natural disasters, and we're all rallying the resources trying to help those disaster areas. And a lot of the disasters we're talking about now are just man-made.
Yes.
You listen to the heartbreak and the misery and the starvation and the death and the women, children, men being blown up and destroyed in Gaza. And it's like so totally and utterly avoidable.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
it's an extraordinary thing, isn't it?
It's not an earthquake, it's not a flood.
Yeah.
This is man-made.
Yeah.
And you listen to the desperation and the cries for help and everything. It is all man-made. We can solve this.
Yeah.
It shouldn't have happened in the first place.
No.
Jesus. So the listener's probably wondering why Alan is talking about men and men's role in all of this. You're the founder and the former CEO of the Men's Development Network.
Yes.
And I love your tagline. Better lives for men, better lives for all.
Yeah.
And we bumped into each other on LinkedIn.
Yes.
And I thought, that's a very curious bio. That's a very curious role to have. I hadn't heard a whole pile about the Men's Development Network. Curious to learn more and who this creature Alan O'Neill is and why did he start it in the first place. So I'm going to start the conversation by asking, who the hell are you and where did you come from?
Right. Well, now I also want to remind you that we did bump into each other briefly before LinkedIn, because one of the campaigns that the Men's Development Network runs is the White Ribbon Campaign, which is an international campaign for men to end violence against women and promote gender equality. And you supported that, and Dee invited me to speak at least one Women's Network event. If not more. And that is certainly 10 years ago, maybe longer.
Thanks for jogging my memory about that. I'm presuming she was the national president for the Women's Network.
Yeah.
Network for Women in Ireland. A very strict organisation where no men are allowed.
Yes.
And it's funny, being close to her, obviously, and observing that female-only network. Now, having said that, I was invited to different events and you were also invited as a speaker. But there's a different dynamic that happens with women.
Yes.
In that organisation, now, like I was heavily involved in Dublin Chamber, for example. I was on the council there. And the male thing is, let's rock up business cards. Let's try and do a bit of business.
Yes.
Let's extract a bit of commerce from this, there's an agenda to everything in a way. Now, not exclusively, but predominantly. And in Deirdre's network, and it was trying to, advance the influence of women in the professions and everything else. It was a much more supportive dynamic. We're all in this together.
Yes.
The business card wasn't for the purpose of a financial transaction. But I think their nature is to let's support each other and lift each other up and pull each other up when you get there. So that male-female dynamic is quite different.
Yes.
Obviously, the balance is really nice when that can be achieved. But, okay, so I'm going to throw the ball back to you now. Who the hell are you and where did you come from?
Well, I'm originally from Dublin, lived in Waterford. My dad was from Tip, and he kept a very strong connection to Tipperary when I was a young fella, and brought me around to meet all the cousins and friends and all that sort of thing. So, and then on my mother's side, we, through her family, we holidayed in Tramore a lot. So I had two very strong connections to the southeast. And then I was an architect in a past life, and I was designing buildings for the Camp Hill community. And then that was in the early 80s, and there was a bit of a crash here in the 80s. And I got a job lecturing in architecture in Waterford Institute of Technology, which is now SETU, Southeast Technological University. And so we ended up living sort of between Waterford and Tramore. And we stayed here. So that's what brought me here.
What did your mum and dad do, Alan?
Well, they did loads of things. First of all, I think I'd like to say that they loved me, which was a very nice thing. Nice to have loving parents. The other thing they did, they had me sort of what we considered late in life. So my mum was 39 and my dad was 46 when I was born. So my friends always thought they were my grandparents, which is... And I found my best friend, who unfortunately died very young, but he used to say it straight out. God, your parents are ancient. In some way, I suppose that gave me some sensitivity, those sort of remarks.
Does that make a difference, your parents being that little bit older?
Yeah, I'll tell you the strong difference it made. They weren't part of the set of parents that my friends had because they were a generation ahead of them. So there wasn't a connection there where other friends' parents would be getting together. My parents were never part of that group of parents. So that was different. And they were my dad was born in 1908. And so his dad was a Victorian. So he was quite old-fashioned in many ways. So that was interesting as well sometimes.
Yeah. What did he work at?
He was in the airline business,
Okay, cool.
travel business. But his main love was horse riding. And my mum's main love, my mum had been a legal secretary, and her main love was tennis and swimming. And both of them were like absolutely top of their game. But they didn't pass any of it on to me or to my sister. There were just the two of us. And they just presumed we'd be able to do it. And we weren't. Because he'd grown up on a farm, so he just hopped up on horses and took to it naturally. And my mother's from a very sporty family, like the photographs of her as a teenager. She's holding a rugby ball or a hockey stick or a tennis racket or whatever. She would send me off for tennis training in Dublin in the summer when I was a young teenager. And sure, I could barely hit the ball. But one thing she did do was, if you came home on a rainy day and there was condensation on the inside the windows, she'd have drawn cartoons on the inside of the window. And I'd say, "Did you draw those?" And she said, "No, I don't know who drew them." She always denied it. She never admitted. But I did get some artistic skills, I think, from her. When I think back they were fabulous cartoons that she drew. And they weren't Mickey Mouse, and they were sort of figures that she made up herself. So, But she was like that. She'd be very secretive about things like that. I wouldn't admit to.
That's kind of strange, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah.
And tell me the conversations around the kitchen table when you were growing up.
Well, now, we didn't have a kitchen table. The kitchen was tiny. We had a dining room table. We had all our meals at the dining room table. And my dad talked about politics, even from a young age. He'd tell us what was going on politically. He was from a very nationalist family, not in a sort of Parnell sort of way, rather than a 1916 sort of way. And that's what I mean. That's probably linking back through his own father's connections. But I mean, they did see the Black and Tans arriving into Tipperary and all that sort of stuff. So, and he lived through the Civil War, and so he had opinions on all of that as well. But the discussions at the table were about what was happening currently politically. So that, I suppose, got me interested in how, maybe if not how the world worked, certainly how Ireland worked. But I do remember him. We used to have a radio up on a wireless, as they were called, up on a high shelf. And I remember the Cuban crisis, and my dad standing up and trying to getting the radio from the States that was reporting on what was happening. And us all sitting silently in the room listening to this as he tuned into it. And he was very, very serious about it and worried about it, obviously, as I'm sure all adults were at the time. So there were moments like that, and obviously JFK's assassination and so on, that we did the same then. They didn't get us a telly till I was 17, so it was all radio.
But if he was born in 1908, he witnessed a lot, didn't he? What a period of time.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, he was 8 in 1916, so he would have been aware of things going on.
Was he living in Dublin at that time, was he?
No, they were all on Tip, and his dad was a councillor on Tipperary County Council, so he was politically involved that way. So there would have been a lot of, and historically, I mean, my great-grandfather, whatever, was in, called the Fenian Brotherhood, or one of those things, and, you know, went out in 1845 or 1865 or whatever. So they had that as well, a bit of that going on in the history of in the background, you know. And
a young Alan O'Neill who wasn't too handy with a tennis racket. But what was occupying yourself as a young fella?
I loved cycling, and I loved painting and drawing. And when I was growing up, the countryside, I grew up in Clonskee in Dublin, and the countryside started at the back of our back garden. And my dad, to my dislike, was into fox hunting. And I don't know if you know the Goat Pub in Dublin at the top of Goatstown Road.
Yeah.
But if you can imagine this, so I was born in 54. So over the next 10 years, the hunt met outside the Goat Pub at the top of Goatstown Road and hunted from there across countryside. That's really hard to believe now if you drive up there now. Oh. And there's photographs of him on a horse in our front drive, you know, going on his way up to the goat. He didn't have a horse. He used to go to stables and borrow a horse or ride someone else's horse. There was a farm behind us that went the whole way up. It was a huge farm, and that became housing eventually. It was like growing up in the countryside. We had huge freedom to roam across, even as the buildings, as the houses were being built, we used to roam around all of this land. And also there were convents on the other side of the road, and we used to wander through there. And then there was what became Belfrid, was another huge estate that was just down a laneway. And we had all of that. There were stables down there as well that we sometimes used to help out in. So it was like a rural upbringing almost. You know, we were right on the edge of sort of the suburbs on one side and rural Ireland being taken over on the other side. It was lovely.
How did a career in architecture grab you?
It grabbed me this way, that I wanted to go to the art college, and I was told that I'd die in a garret if I became an artist. Die starving in a garret. And I thought, oh, right, that doesn't sound great. And it was suggested to me that I use my skills for something that would earn me a living. And that's why I applied for architecture. And that's why I did it. And I really enjoyed it. I did well in it. It's always had that feeling. And I really enjoy it now. To this day, I'm doing a bit of it again, and a very small bit. And I just enjoy doing architectural drawings. I just love having a pencil in my hand, one way or the other, whatever I'm drawing. So, and I thought, yeah, I love having a biro. Biros are great for drawing with. But so I did like the drawing bit and the creativity bit and imagining things, imagining buildings. And I mean, it's just lovely. Someone comes along and says, have you any ideas for this? And you can or I can draw something and say, oh yeah, look, it could look like this or whatever, and imagine it for them. And it's a lovely creative process.
I imagine even better watching that thing that you imagined, demonstrating that to a client, and then overseeing the project and bringing it to life must be an amazing feeling.
Yeah, absolutely. And I remember this is so ordinary in a way, but extraordinary as well, in that the first job I got, I was given a section through a staircase, a stairwell to draw. And it was going to be what's called fair face block work. So there'd be no plaster on the blocks. So I drew all the blocks in behind the section through the concrete stairs. And then I was sent out on site to see that it had been built correctly. And the builder had built the blocks exactly as I'd drawn them on the drawing. And I had drawn them very carefully so they suited where the steps were and all of that. And I was just blown away. I was holding the drawing, looking at the block layer and looking at the wall, just going, this is absolute magic. I mean, you just think people walk past block work and they don't even see it. And I'm almost salivating going, this is fantastic. You can draw a line and a block layer will place his block exactly where you've drawn that line, which is incredible.
Some skill on his part, isn't it?
Oh, incredible. Block layers are magicians. I think they're wonderful.
So it must be a really nice thing. Obviously, you've been involved in different construction projects here and there, and being able to drive around the place and spot your work.
Yeah, well, that's nice too. Yeah, it is. It is lovely. It's a very satisfying feeling. All right, and also that people are using it and enjoying it, and it's working for them.
Yeah,
that's and it's warm and it's dry and it's got no wood lice in it.
When was the Men's Development Network born? When was the first idea? When was the first conversation? How did that come about?
I knew a priest when I was 17 or 18, and he said he wanted to pull together a young men's group, discussion group that would be confidential. So I joined that. I know most of the guys who are in it to this day, and I bar myself and maybe one or two others, they all hated it. Now, the priest had been to Boston and had witnessed the men's movement. I'd never heard of the men's movement. I don't think there was very little going on in Ireland, if anything, at the time. But he'd witnessed it over there, and it had obviously been in men's groups over there when I think back at it now. So he decided to apply that here. I think of it now, I think of a priest inviting young men into a group now, there'd be all sorts of questions raised. But he was a decent man. But he wasn't a trained facilitator and he wasn't very experienced. So when difficulties arose between one or two guys sort of across the group, he really didn't know what to do. And he didn't know that what he might have known is that somebody's feelings, particularly guys' feelings, projecting them onto somebody else isn't useful, and that he actually needed to focus on the guy and what was going on for him, rather than sitting back and just letting it happen. Now, some encounter groups work that way; they just let whatever happen. I wouldn't be into that. But anyway, that was the seed of it. And then I went to college, and there was a guy there said to me, I don't know how many, I think maybe I was in second or third year. He said, do you know, I don't know why he said it to me. He said, do you know, there's a group of men meeting up in the teacher centre in Parnell Square. No, Mountjoy Square. I was doing architecture in Bolton Street. And he said, it's on Saturday. Do you want to come? And I said, yeah, I'd love to come. And I went along there, and there were guys there who were a bit older than me and were in touch with men in England, I suppose London mostly, and in the States, that were running men's groups and doing all sorts of different types of groups of men. And they were both, I suppose, copying that, but also inviting these men's leaders, as they were called, over to run events here. So then I discovered there were these events going on. And so I started going to them. And so that was the start of my involvement in it. And the other thing I suppose it reminds me is my dad used to always say, especially when I was a teenager, always remember to respect women. So I've done my best to do that. I'm not sure that, like any man, I'm not sure it was perfect in that. But I've always had that in the back of my mind. So there was also that gender equality bit that my dad triggered in me, or had planted that seed in me. And so that was that. And I sort of kept that interest going. And then it was later. Oh, yeah, it was when we had children. When we had children and we had 3 sons, it was like, how do you bring boys up without insisting that they're conditioned to be masculine in the way that is in the things that are considered masculine? And I suppose in a way, not being any good at sport probably did me a favor, in that I wasn't pulled into that side of things, which I love. I love watching certain sports. So it didn't put me off that. But just something about being able to see, well, there are things going on here that say, this is the way you're to be as a man. And if you're not that, then there's something wrong with you. Just to use shorthand there. And, big boys don't cry and all that stuff that we've all heard. I'm really struck by Greg in watching the Euros there, where I don't know if you watched Ronaldo missing a penalty or his penalty getting saved, and then it was the end of the match, and he cried. He went over to his teammates and he bawled. And Gary Lineker was saying things like, "Oh, someone needs to have a word with him," And I really like Gary. I'd be a fan, but he said it very sternly. And I've heard him say things like that before. I'm saying, no, this guy Ronaldo is really smart. He's so disappointed. He's crying it all out of his system. He knows exactly what he's doing. His teammates are around hugging him, whispering support into his ear, into both his ears. They're hugging him tight. They're all around him. They're allowing him cry. They're encouraging him. He's getting that, washing that disappointment out of his system. And he comes back on ready to play again. And when it comes to penalties, the first to stand up, and he scores his penalty. Now that's information that boys need and that men need. That when we've got huge disappointment or loss or frustration in our lives, we need to cry it out. We need to get it out of our system. We need to stamp our feet. We need and we need the support of other men around us saying, yeah, get that out. You don't need to be carrying that around with you. And I don't know how smart those guys were, but those subs that are around them, they seem to be smart enough to think, we need this guy in good shape going back onto the pitch.
Yeah.
So let's help him get this out of himself. And that's what every man needs, is other guys around him saying, you don't need to be carrying that around with you. You don't need that dragging you down. You need to be able to operate at your best, and be fully human here. I mean, Ronaldo was being fully human. It brings some tears to my own eyes thinking of it. He was displaying for all the men watching, this is the way to be. Be fully human, be affected by the disappointments that happen to you. Clear them out and carry on, So that's a quick jump from where I started to now. But that's where somewhere along the way, I think in the 80s then, I found a place where I could do that through mostly American men's leaders coming over and running weekends around Ireland and going to those. And then I started I didn't. I know what I did. I started a fathers group in the local village here first and invited my male friends who were fathers to that. And we did that. A man just reminded me of that the other day, that he'd been in it. And then from the fathers group, somebody said, there's a men's event on, do you want to go to that? And that's how I got into it. And then I started a men's group, and out of the men's group, a few of us started going to other towns and community centres, inviting men to join groups. And then one of the men eventually said, hey, I think we can get funding for this. And I went to see Michael Woods. He was Minister for Social Welfare, I think, at the time. And he said, under the equality regulations in the EU, which is probably the EEC at the time, they funded women's organizations. So they'll have to fund men's organizations. And he gave us our first funding to get going, and we got going in 1997.
What was your objective for the organization at that point in time? What was your idea?
The idea was that just as much as I and the other men who'd joined me had found a safe and confidential space to be ourselves and also to express our feelings and be supported too. So whatever tensions, frustrations, but also things like connection and love, which can also bring tears, and it could be tears of joy. But again, men find it hard to find a place to express joy that brings tears. So finding a safe, confidential space to do that and to try and be as fully human as we could be in that space, and then bring that out into bring it back out into our families, into our relationships, into our workplaces, and wherever we met other men as well. But the first funding we got was in 1997. There were still men long-term unemployed after the crash in the 80s. And the first funding, because Michael Woods was the Minister for Social Welfare, was to work with long-term unemployed men. So what we did was we went out to community centres and community development projects in various towns and asked them if there were any men involved. And most of them didn't. It was mostly women who had realised very quickly, as you described earlier, how they immediately are drawn to support. They understand support and supporting each other. So a community development project opens up in your town or your housing estate, and the women are drawn to it because it's supportive. And the men are shy of it because it's supportive. So we'd go in and say, are there any men? And then we'd ask them to invite men to come to a meeting for men. And 6 or 8 men would turn up, and we'd start a men's group. And we ran those groups for years. And then we'd have regional and local, and we'd have regional days, local and regional days. And then we'd have national summer schools. We had a national men's summer school every year for 25 years, certainly 20 years anyway. And you get about 80 to 100 men coming to that.
Because that male bonding, without it being organised in that way, probably happened at the golf club, maybe with your local football teams or your GA teams, maybe under the umbrella of the Freemasons or something like that. These kind of specific men clubs. But that male relationship, the man-to-man relationship is a very peculiar thing, and I know a lot of men struggle emotionally and everything else to share things with people. But being very, very specific about it, and the kinds of things that you're talking about, what you were mentioning with Ronaldo and sharing your feelings and all that kind of thing. Yeah, it's not the domain that a lot of males would be comfortable in, really, is it?
Oh, I know. And the great thing is, it's really embarrassing. And the great thing then is you're in a men's group and a man is really embarrassed. So then we can encourage each other to go purple and be really embarrassed. And in a place where you won't be slagged for being embarrassed, it won't be laughed at for being embarrassed. You'll be encouraged to feel the whole feeling, because it'll make you go purple, it'll make you sweat. And as the sweat and the colour comes out in your face, you're recovering from the embarrassment as that happens. So the more embarrassed you can get in a safe place, the less embarrassed you'll be in the future out in the world. And it's the same with the tears of disappointment, the laughter that comes with nervousness or tension or anxiety, the sweats that come with fear, the shakes that come with fear, all of those things. If there's a safe place to express all of those things by letting them happen. And I mean, I was a guy, I never spoke publicly. When I was a youngster, I was so shy of speaking. If I was in a group or anything like that, I'd almost choke. I think it was like a tennis ball getting stuck in my throat. And through this, I was able to speak publicly, start an organization, go and meet a minister, ask for funding, ask for support, say why, all of these things. When before that, I would have been way too nervous to do any of those things. And even though I had in architecture had to present schemes and so on. That was something like that I created so I could talk to that. But having to stand up with nothing, only myself, to say, look, this is important. I wasn't able to do that until I had been through the men's development process.
And Alan, the shape of the organization and the different services that are being offered, how do they evolve over time?
Well, that was really interesting because, and this was really useful from the point of view of looking for funding. When you sit down with a group of men and you say, well, what's going on in your life? Well, some guys, they're all going to say, each of us is going to say what's going on in our life. And so you have a list of issues. If I'm the facilitator of that group and I'm standing there with a flip chart or a notebook or whatever, we tried to make as far away from flip chart culture as we could. But just if you're taking a note of things, you'll notice there'll be health issues, there'll be education issues, there'll be relationship issues, there'll be violence issues, confidence issues, some of the things I've talked about already coming up. So then we could see, one of the things that came out really strongly was that there was a huge issue around men's health. And men, basically, the old one, and it's still true, that men don't go to the doctor. And that it's our wives and girlfriends and our mothers that insist we go. So sure enough, we found that men weren't going to the doctor. And I'd already got into the habit of having an annual health check. And as I get older now, I notice some of my friends of the same age and older are having 6 monthly health checks. This all makes sense because if you catch something quicker, you have a better chance with it and all of that. But anyway, we then had a list of health issues that men were struggling with. And we could go to the Department of Health and say, look, we know that men's health is part of your brief. We can do this piece of that for you. We can engage with men, raise men's health as an issue because we now know we have chapter and verse on it from all the men, hundreds of men we've listened to across the country. And the Department of Health and the HSE said, yes, please, we'll have that. And it's now the National Men's Health Programme run by the Men's Development Network. And that's after a couple of decades of building that to that place.
You'll enjoy the story, Alan, when Deirdre was had that role in Network Ireland. You can imagine a lot of the conversations I would end up participating in.
Yeah.
And a lot of it used to come down to, gender equality and a lot of very passionate women telling you how unfair the world was against them. So one of my pet little hobby horses was when this conversation would kick off, I go, wow. I'd say to them, what's the biggest inequality of all between men and women? And they were like, oh, I don't know. And they'd trot out all the usual things. And I'd say things to them like, well, what's the most precious thing in life? And of course, I was waiting for them to say, well, it's living. Living is the most important thing. Every moment you're on this earth is precious. But I said, what if I said to you 3.8 years? What if I gave you a number like that? What would you say about it? Would you know what I'm talking about? Saying, we have no idea what you're talking about. Well, let me tell you about the biggest inequality ever. Yeah. Yes. Men are living on this earth 3.8 years less on average than women. Yes. And I don't hear anyone banging on about that.
Yes.
That's a travesty. That's inequality. And funnily enough, I was saying this to a particular woman working in one of the universities who was like fully charged about inequality and all that kind of thing. And the conversation really struck a chord with her. And I know that the next time we were back, they were saying that was a program that they were introducing in the university because I had a really good point.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was also a point that we brought to men's attention to say, well, one of the reasons why we're living shorter lives is because we don't attend to our health. While women are, from the minute they have their first period, are engaged in their own health. From the age of 12, it's all about their health. And their bodies bring their attention to their health at that point. And we don't have that experience particularly underlined in that way by our bodies. And we're very energetic human beings. And we like just keeping going and just enjoying ourselves and so on. And so it's really useful. That 3.8 years has been really useful for men's health and bringing men's attention to looking after ourselves.
Yeah. So basically, the organization evolved by looking at the different issues that were being discussed at your weekly meetings and introducing programs for those specific things. It makes an awful lot of sense.
And coming from a really basic question, Greg, which was even as basic as how are you? And you know the way we say how are you or how are you to each other, and we don't listen to the answer. But in these groups, we asked it purposely and listened to the answers. And if a fella said, I'm grand, we'd say, what do you mean by grand? And they'd sort of sit back and go, what do you mean? He'd say, well, you said you're grand. What do you mean by grand? He'd say, I'm okay. What do you mean by okay? And we're kind of relentless and kindly relentless in just pursuing it. And eventually the guy would say, well, now just say it. I'm not that grand, really. And then he'd start talking about how his life really was. And then work through the feelings around that. And then we'd always end with, well, what's one step you can take? You know, having worked through the feelings. The great thing about working through the feelings is it clarifies our thinking. Like, again, to go back to the Ronaldo example, that crying was able to clarify his thinking and focus him on what he needed to do next. And the same for a man in the men's development group once asked, what's one step, one small step even that you could take? He'd go, right, well, I could do such and such. And if it was something to do with his wife or his partner, or his children, he'd say, well, I'll bring that home now and I'll do that. And then the next week or the next fortnight when we're meeting again, everybody would report in and say, well, how did that step go for you? And then he'd be able to work through the positives or the negatives or the mixture and think, okay, now what could I have done differently? You know, but also in between those things, work on the feelings, the frustration of it not working, or celebrate the success of it working very well.
And some of the specific services that I spotted on the website, I know there's counselling.
Yes.
You have the male advice line.
Yeah.
The different health programs. And then you've got the MEND program. Do you want to talk about some of those things with me?
Well, one of the things that men obviously struggle with, and it can be seen every day on the RTE news or any news at the moment, I mean, is the level of men's violence against women. It's just so awful, really. And I mean, it's awful in two ways. It's awful, clearly and obviously awful for the women who are the victims of it. And it's so awful sometimes that they're killed by the men. But it's awful as well, and I don't mean this in any way as sympathy for the actions, the violent actions of those men, but it's awful that men have ended up doing that. Like, what has happened to those men that didn't happen to you or I, that they ended up turning on a woman, violently attacking her, raping her, sexually abusing